IVM.
I want to thank Intel for supporting our show. We're all loving working from home, but let's be honest, there are complications. For example, getting help from IT folks if your PC is down can be challenging because you can't just walk up to them anymore. Well, you'll be happy to hear that I have a solution for you, the Intel vPro platform. The platform comes packed with Intel Active Management technology that lets your IT teams remotely manage your systems and fix the problems without having to go to them. So it means more time getting your work done and less time spent on getting support. Visit intel.in/morewithvpro, that's VPRO, to discover how you can do more of what you want and less of what you don't. If you're listening on the IVM Podcast Android app, click the link that's visible to you now.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome to All Things Policy. Recently, China's President Xi Jinping addressed a central symposium on Tibet, in which he actually laid out some of the ideas for how China would govern Tibet and the relationship between the state and the Tibetan people. To understand more of what this means, not just for Tibetans, but also what it would mean for India, I have with me the China dude himself, Manoj. Welcome, Manoj.
Hey, thanks. Good to be here.
Okay, Manoj, firstly, this is a speech where, you see the excerpts from it. It's all party speak. Can you decipher it for us? Tell us what exactly Xi Jinping was getting at.
Yeah, so that's the challenge, right? I mean, there's so much of, convoluted stuff that's said that you have to end up read between the lines in terms of what it means. And even then, it's really complicated because, I was recently talking to some Indian China watchers, and they were asking me about, they were asking in a group about, have the people who understood the speech, can you tell us, does it project confidence? Does it project weakness? Does it project anxiety? And the answer is that it does everything. And that's just the nature of how party speech works, right? There's always some degree of confidence, there's always some degree of anxiety. And I think this speech also does that. Yet, once you pass through it, you can see some strands that you can pick up on and figure out as to what is the meaning and what is the objective that is being laid out. Generally, some of these speeches tend to be extremely verbose and very dull and dry, and this was no exception. So this is the central symposium is held every once in a while. The last time it was held was in 2015. That was the 6th Central Symposium on Tibet work, and this one was the 7th one. And this happened over the weekend on the 28th and 29th of August. So what Xi Jinping primarily said, right, his primary message was that, look, we need to continue doing what we were doing in Tibet. And that's a mix of many things. But he's basically saying, I'll tell you what that's a mix of. But he basically says that we need to continue doing what we were doing. And the language that he uses is that it's necessary to fully implement the party's strategy for governing Tibet in the new era. And why do we need to continue doing it? We need to continue doing it because it is a matter of not just stability in Tibet, but also broader national security. So he sees the party's work in the region as critical to broader national security of the country as a whole. And I think that's the one thing. He has an objective in mind, which is to quote-unquote build a new socialist modern Tibet. That's as vague as anything can be. But if you look at it from the point of view of the party's broader objectives, what one gets a sense is that he's talking about, poverty alleviation, development, employment, all those socio-economic parameters. At the same time, he's talking about party control, effective governance of the party's mechanism within the Tibetan area, making sure that political loyalty exists and is stringently implemented, making sure that education is as per the writ of the party, and all of those things which are part of the broader goal of making China a modern socialist country would also apply to Tibet. And that's what he's trying to say, that, in order to get there, what we need to do is essentially implement what has been the party's strategy for government.
Right. Now, compared to the last Central Symposium, what is the big change? Is there greater insecurity, perhaps?
So I think I think we need to sort of go back. So I said the last Central Symposium was 2015, right? But I mean, change in Chinese policies with regard to Tibet, sort of the hardening of the central government's policies, begin after 2008. It's not like before that it was all sort of mellow and fun, but the sort of serious tightening happens after 2008. And that's because in 2008, you see a series of protests erupt across Tibet, and also not just within Tibet, but also in sort of Tibetan communities around China. And around the world. And this is in the lead up to the Beijing Olympics. And if people recall, there were lots of monks and who were immolating themselves in protest as the Olympics were coming. And after that, sort of the party sort of took stock of things, and they imposed a very tough line across Tibet. By 2011, this got even tougher. So it became far more systematic. And you had something called grid policing, wherein essentially you divided cities and towns and areas into different grids, and you created police stations, you securitized the area, so that there was such a heavy-handed security presence that, freedom of movement, expression, thought, everything sort of starts to get curtailed. At the same time, in 2012, they did something like they sort of pushed back against religion, because again, it was monks who were self-immolating, and obviously religion and religious independence has a big part to play with the overall struggle of Tibet's autonomy. And I think in that context, they sort of cracked down on religion. Party cadres were installed in different monasteries across Tibet. And that was to sort of, again, cynicize religion, but control thought, control sort of ideas, and sort of indoctrinate going forward. So those are sort of policies that have continued. And that's what I say when Xi Jinping says that, continue the party strategy or fully implement the party strategy for governing Tibet in the new era. He implies a mix of all of these. And these sort of things continue. Now, as far as whether the 2015 symposium show and sort of comparison to that, do we see greater insecurity or not? I mean, it's really difficult to sort of talk about greater or less insecurity, right? Because I think what's happened in the last few years is that last year or so, my sense has been that the Communist Party has been far more comfortable with regard to the way things are in Tibet. Their priority when it came to sort of ethnic minorities was in Xinjiang in 2015, 2016, that period of time onwards. But I think the sort of things have begun to change right now. I think they are far more comfortable today with the way things are in Xinjiang. Yet there is a deep anxiety with regard to what's happening in Tibet. And that's basically because you're seeing change happening not just around the world, but also within the landscape in Tibet with the Dalai Lama's age and the possibility of chaos following, whenever he passes away and following his succession, and that issue. And I think what happened in this symposium to me reflects anxiety on that front. Because Xi Jinping says something like, we must adhere to strategic thinking that governing the country requires to stabilize the borders of Tibet and sort of govern Tibet well, stabilize governance in Tibet rather than sort of thinking of broader governance. So I think he's talking about stability first and governance later. And that sort of, to me, hints at anxiety. And hints at a sense that this concern about local pushback against the party is enduring, and today it remains reasonably high, particularly because of the international environment. The US has sort of taken a tougher line on Tibet. Today it's taken a much tougher line than it had, say, in the last 6, 7, 8 years. In December last year, you had the US pass something called the Reciprocal Access Act. And I think that is sort of the Reciprocal Access to Tibet Act. I think that was one of the things which was sort of a concrete step taken where the US was saying that, if you're not going to allow us access, American citizens, government officials, journalists, to Tibet, then, we will also deny access to you. So I think those are the kinds of things that are changing. And I think the fear is that if the Dalai Lama passes away and the succession issue becomes a hot potato, which the US is again, sort of just this week, Mike Pompeo was saying that China needs to take a backseat to whatever happens with regard to the succession of the Dalai Lama. So I think those concerns are therefore prompting Xi Jinping to sort of say that what we've done has been successful compared to, say, 2008, 2009 onwards. And given the sort of sensitivities and given the sort of insecurities that we have going ahead, we need to double down on what we have done. And we need to do more of it and with much greater intensity.
All right. Now, what about India? Where does India fit into China's concerns about what happens after the Dalai Lama? And is there any indication of Indian thinking here?
So, we've not really seen too much of, so for the last few years, if you look at what India has done, right? So ever since sort of heading into Wuhan, that informal summit, and subsequently, the Indian government has taken a hands-off approach with regards to the Tibet issue. The fact that at the time of those summits, there were reports about, ministers and officials being told not to attend the events related to the Dalai Lama, told you a little bit about the fact that India wanted to maintain a hands-off issue. Yet, if you look at the last 3, 4, 5 months, you've seen, Indian sort of state media covering, carrying comments and carrying interviews with members of the Central Tibet administration. You've seen in the last week, we've seen this issue that's happened at the LAC, where there's been talk about, obviously, the death of a Tibetan soldier on the LAC. So I think there's been a little bit more sort of public discussion around this in India, yet it's really unclear in terms of what the government's position would be. My sense is that the government has officially taken a hands-off position to the issue of secession, and so far nothing tells me that that is changing. So the Indian government seems to be fairly clear that it's not necessarily going to get involved in this, and I can't recall a single statement issued by any Indian official which essentially talks about, like in a sort of government official capacity,
right,
which talks about the secession of the Dalai Lama and what China must do and what it must not do. Instead, on the other hand, you've actually seen the Chinese officials over the last couple of years actually issue direct statements talking about India and saying that you need to keep your hands off this. So I think that tells you a little bit about their anxieties, but I don't think we've seen anything from the Indian government's point of view in terms of any official position. If you've seen anything, it's about sort of taking a hands-off approach, which I think is fair, right? If your argument is that this is a religious event and this is a religious ceremony, it has to be done by religious law, then it might as well be done by religious law. And you don't need to take a position on it. It can just happen and it can still work for you.
Yes. Yeah.
So you don't need to take an official position on it. But I think that's one of the concerns that they have, given that the CTA is located in India and the Dalai Lama is in India. And the future of such a large number of such a strong Tibetan community lives in India, and it's a fairly vocal community.
Yeah.
So I think their concerns are with regard to that on India. But I think from an Indian point of view, what Xi Jinping has spoken about in the symposium, I think there are sort of broader implications also from an Indian point of view. We'll sort of get to that. Let's just first try and look at what's domestically in terms of
we'll get back to India, like you said. But what I'm just wondering is, how is the Chinese government trying to draw Tibetans in closer into the Chinese system? They do mention adherence to Communist Party thought and so on, but there's also other things, regarding religion, ideological education and so on. What are these?
Yeah, it's really, in many ways, the Communist Party of China has shown quite a bit of adaptability over the decades to be able to survive for so long and even thrive. Yet at the same time, it's sort of, it knows one way to do things in many ways. So, for example, in this speech, Xi Jinping talks about a couple of things, right? He talks about adhering to the direction of Sinicization of religion, which essentially talks about continuation of existing policy. And like I said, starting from 2011 onwards, you had cadres installed in monasteries. You make sure that Tibetan monasteries, which hold a sway over people, don't necessarily deviate from the party line. And that is going to continue. And the objective of this is essentially to make sure that religion, while it may function the way it can, it should not challenge the bottom line, that is the legitimacy of the party's rule in Tibet or across what is seen as China. And that's the one thing. And the idea that, religion must not, the cross-border linkages of religion are secondary or immaterial. What matters is that it's China first. And that's the idea of Sinicization of religion. And that sort of comes with sustained indoctrination, sustained education, which prioritizes the Chinese-ness of the people in that area as opposed to their religious affiliation. And that's the idea, right? You prioritize the Chinese-ness, your national identity, as opposed to your religious identity, and make religious identity secondary or immaterial. And I think that's done through ideological education. Ideological education essentially implies that throughout sort of schooling, and this is one thing that Xi Jinping has emphasized across the country. So He wants political and ideological education at all levels. He even at times, there's a different component of this called national security education. And all of these have to be factored in from primary to university levels. And school and children need to be brought up in an environment where they understand the significance, so where they understand history from the point of view of the Communist Party, which is essentially that, that the Chinese nation, as they would call it, was subjugated, was once great, was then subjugated, remained subjugated. These divisions were sort of sown, seeds of divisions were sown in, and it's the Communist Party that's managed to pull everything back together, and not just pull it back together and create so-called new China, but also, subsequently stabilize things. And in the words of Xi Jinping, because of the Communist Party, China has not just stood up, grown rich, but is now becoming strong. And the only way to survive and the only guarantee for the future is the rule of the Communist Party. So that's one part of all of this. And the other part of all of this is that you need to sort of focus more on your Chinese identity as opposed to everything else. And that's why in his speech, Xi Jinping said something to the effect of, the objective of ideological education is to plant the seeds of loving China into the depths of the hearts of every youth. And I think that sort of tells you a little bit about what the objective is. Along with that, he sort of talked about this really interesting, which I thought was really interesting because it's something that will impact India quite directly. He talked about the fact that it's important to find historical connections between China, what is seen as sort of mainland China, and these sort of frontier regions, and in this case, obviously Tibet, and to identify these so-called quote-unquote historical facts, dig them out, sort them out, and publicize them that link the PRC to Tibet. I think the objectives there is sort of quite clear. It's about showing that this is not a manufactured identity of this China with Tibet as part of it, of the PRC with Tibet as part of it. It is an organic historical identity that existed. The challenge is that, to me, from my point of view, this will bleed into China's claims on Arunachal Pradesh. And we've seen sort of, there's been so much conversation about Chinese public opinion warfare, psychological warfare, and legal warfare, the so-called three warfares. And I think this will sort of buttress those claims. And the thing with this is that as cynically as we may want to look at this, over a period of time, once these claims are repeated and reiterated, and once they are internalized by a coming generation of officials and bureaucrats and negotiators and diplomats and the general public, it becomes that much harder to arrive at sort of compromise settlements on issues like the border.
Yeah, and but what would the Chinese gain from, say, not giving themselves maneuver room over Tawang?
I don't think that they sort of are thinking of it in that context. I think what they're thinking of is in the context of the fact that we need to be able to create some of these, to be able to link Tibet and sort of to be able to capture the minds of Tibetans at present, the sort of coming generation. And that's what they are looking at. To me, what will happen with regard to Arunachal will be incidental to that. Yet it will be significant.
Okay.
I don't think that's necessarily the primary objective. The primary objective is that, you create an environment in which Tibetans feel that they have historically been a part of this entity called China.
Right. Now, a lot of what you're saying sounds very bleak if you're an average Tibetan. Is there something to look forward to? Are there economic opportunities? Is there a silver lining for Tibetans?
So the way I look at it, to me, the plan that Xi Jinping has outlined has sort of 5 prongs to it. One is persuasion, of which this historical business is all part of. One is indoctrination, which I've spoken about. One is coercion, which we sort of touched upon, but, when Xi Jinping spoke about things like border defenses and creating an impregnable fortress and this whole business of, seeds of loving China in the hearts of people, to me, that's sort of also coercion deeply embedded in all of that. And when I fear the fact that, you may get a Xinjiang type internment camp model in Tibet, if there is serious upheaval over the issue of succession, those all sort of aspects are about coercion. So I'm thinking that, in that sense, yes, it's going to be extremely bleak going forward. But the sort of carrot that he's offering is essentially development and connectivity. Last year in December, we all know that China is this is the year where China says that they've eliminated extreme poverty. Last year in December, the party secretary for Tibet had announced that essentially every county and district of Tibet that was designated as poor is no longer designated as poor. Poverty has been uplifted across Tibet as of December last year, according to the party secretary of Tibet. In this, just before this symposium, you had three interesting visits to Tibet. Right? In July, you had Wang Yang, who heads the CPPCC and is a Politburo standing committee member. He visited there and spoke about separatism and the rest of it, and ethnic unity. In April first week, you had Hu Chunhua, who is the vice premier. He's dealing with essentially poverty alleviation. He visited and he essentially talked about the fact that we need to make sure that, yes, while we've achieved this decisive victory, we need to make sure that people don't fall back into poverty. So therefore, there's going to be a fair amount of economic support policies that you can see, because that's part of the sort of broader legitimacy that the party desires to command. And then you had Wang Yi going there, who's a foreign minister. He went to Tibet. Again, very rare that he does this. And he spoke about border defense and creating a better life for people living on the borders and things like that. So to me, those sort of informed of what the approach is. You've got coercion, you've got development, you've got economic carrots in terms of creating opportunities for local Tibetans. In his speech, Xi Jinping spoke about, how it is important for, different other provinces. So he spoke about Qinghai, he spoke about Sichuan, he spoke about Yunnan and Gansu, and party committees from those provinces to work to build connectivity with Tibet. So you're going to see greater infrastructure projects that connect Tibet to these provinces, but also laid it on their doorstep to sort of create developmental opportunities for people in Tibet. So I presume you're going to see a systematic effort to get people from Tibet to work in these provinces, or to at least get funding support and also just get developmental project support in this. Lastly, he spoke about sort of the ecology and the environment, talking about how that's entirely important from a broader national security point of view also, and in Tibet, from a resource point of view, water and all of that. And I think you're going to see more work on that front also. So I think he's offering that mix of, a better life in terms of, but a better life coming with conditions attached to your political, your social, your religious freedoms, and more so restrictions on those, particularly given the sort of threats that he sees coming ahead.
One final question, Manoj, is in any of this, is there any indication that there may be more Han Chinese migration into Tibet?
If I was to take the fact that he's saying that he is going to continue the direction of his policy, it seems like yes, that's something that he's going to talk about. Yet that wasn't specifically spoken about, and I wouldn't see them anyway talking about it specifically. But I think it probably does happen when he talks about, deeper linkages with Sichuan, Qinghai, Gansu, although there are significant other minorities living in these areas, particularly people of Tibetan origin living in these areas. So, but I don't think that the general trend of Han Chinese migration is going to significantly change. I think that's going to continue as required. And particularly if we see far greater chaos within Tibetan communities during the succession situation, then you're probably going to see it far more sustained over a period of time, that you will see greater migration, because the trust levels between that group, between the Tibetans and the Han Chinese, sort of breaks down. So then I presume the party will want to have more Han Chinese cadres and more Han Chinese officers and officials in Tibet to manage the situation, because you would not necessarily trust the Tibetans. So in that sense, I think to me, that's something that I would speculate that will happen.
Not terribly great news for Tibetans, I suppose, and may present some problems for India as well. But this has been very informative. Thank you so much, Manoj.
Thank you.
And thank you for joining us on All Things Policy.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.
I hope you enjoyed that show. It's been a really fun week this week, as it is almost every week, but this week was particularly fun. Farmisha Honey was on Cyrus Says, great conversation over there. We had a crossover event. Vineet Kanabar, host of the Storytellers and Storytellers podcast, came on Uncle Please Sit. Really interesting conversation about the future of digital content. Besides that, it was the 50th episode this week of Agla Station Adulthood. Congratulations to Ritasha and Ayushi. But yeah, they're 50 episodes down. They had Rekha Jha as the guest on that show. On Advertising is Dead, Varun had the founders of Foxy Moron, Suvir Bajaj and Pratik Gupta on. Another really, really interesting conversation. So full of interesting conversations this week, and I hope to see you again next week.
Have you ever wondered how successful people do their thing? How do they navigate the challenges they often face? Are you wondering about the future of restaurants, film, education, technology, and everything else in between? Hi, I'm Gauri Devidayal, best known for being one of the brains behind The Table, an award-winning restaurant in Bombay. One thing my life as a restaurateur has given me is the opportunity to meet with some truly inspiring people, most often just by chatting with strangers at the community table. And that's what this podcast is about. It's about learning the new dimensions of business and understanding how different people swim this sea. It's an opportunity for me to pick their brains and ask them all the questions on my mind, whether it's about learning from their past experiences or talking about future trends. Through their journeys, stories, and insights, I hope you too, like me, will come away inspired and energized. So come, join me every Wednesday with your favorite drink, because this round is on me.